Something is happening inside the Tehran regime right now that represents the most significant shift in this crisis since it began. Not because of what you are seeing in the headlines. Actually, the headlines are covering this exactly backward. Before this video proceeds further, here are the specific anchor points that the analysis ahead will document and connect. Speaker of the Iranian parliament Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, a former Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commander, the lead Iranian negotiator under Pakistani mediation with Washington, and one of the most senior surviving figures in the post-Khamenei power structure, has been forced to resign as head of Iran's negotiating team. President Masoud Pezeshkian reportedly attempted to resign in March 2026 after the Israeli airstrike that killed senior security official Ali Larijani, telling his inner circle that the IRGC had cut him out of military and strategic decisions and would not even allow him to speak with the new supreme leader. Vice President Mohammad Reza Aref has attempted to resign multiple times, with President Pezeshkian rejecting the requests under conditions that the moderate Iranian press has now begun describing publicly as a cycle of resignations that will continue. 3 senior presidential aides have resigned across the past 2 months, citing restrictions on expressing their views and the imposition of hardline appointees under the banner of national consensus. President Pezeshkian and Speaker Ghalibaf are jointly seeking the dismissal of Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi over what informed sources describe as Araghchi acting less as a cabinet minister than as an aide to Ahmad Vahidi, the IRGC commander now described in regional reporting as the most powerful figure in the force. A confidential survey conducted by the Iranian Students' Polling Agency, leaked through the presidency itself, indicated public dissatisfaction approaching 92%. Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei has been in office for 2 months, having succeeded his father Ali Khamenei after the latter was killed in the United States airstrike on Tehran on February 28 that also killed more than 40 senior Iranian officials. The internal disputes between civilian and clerical factions have already derailed Iranian negotiating delegations from traveling to Islamabad for talks with Washington. Each of these anchor points connects to the others in a single coherent pattern, and the pattern reveals what the headlines have not yet captured. The commercial press is reporting Ghalibaf's resignation as a tactical reshuffle of the Iranian negotiating team, as an internal political maneuver, as the routine churn of personnel that any government experiences during periods of stress. That framing is not just incomplete, it is wrong in a way that obscures the single most consequential structural development inside the Islamic Republic since the consolidation of clerical authority that followed the death of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini in 1989. Because what has actually occurred is not a tactical reshuffle. It is the visible manifestation of the structural collapse of the dual-track governance model that has defined the Islamic Republic for nearly 4 decades, the carefully calibrated balance between elected civilian institutions and unelected clerical authority that allowed the regime to maintain both revolutionary legitimacy and functional government simultaneously. That model has not been formally repudiated. The Iranian constitution remains technically in force. The presidential office remains technically operational. The parliament continues to convene, but the operational reality has diverged from the institutional structure. The civilian institutions have been progressively hollowed of authority across the past 60 days, with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps under Commander Ahmad Vahidi capturing the substantive decision-making functions while leaving the civilian shell in place to maintain the appearance of continuity. Ghalibaf's forced resignation is the most senior public expression of this transformation, but it is not the transformation itself. The transformation is the underlying structural shift that produces a continuous stream of resignations, sidelinings, dismissals, and forced exits across every level of the civilian government, while the IRGC consolidates control of the operational state. The question that matters is not who has resigned this week. The question is what the cumulative pattern of resignations, refused resignations, dismissals, and structural exclusions reveals about the actual locus of authority inside the post-February 28 Iranian state, and what the relocation of authority means for every diplomatic, economic, and military interlocutor that has been engaging with the Islamic Republic on the assumption that a coherent government exists with which to engage. The answer to that question reveals why the operational reality of the Tehran regime has just fundamentally broken from the institutional structure that has historically defined it. To understand what has actually happened, you have to understand the specific structure of the Islamic Republic as it was designed by Khomeini and as it has functioned across the 4 decades of its existence. The structure was conceived around the doctrine of velayat-e-faqih, guardianship of the Islamic jurist, which placed ultimate authority in the hands of a clerical supreme leader while permitting subordinate civilian institutions to manage day-to-day governance. The supreme leader retained final authority over military matters, foreign policy, judicial appointments, and the broad direction of state policy, but the elected president and parliament managed budget allocations, regulatory decisions, ministry-level appointments, and the ordinary functioning of state administration. The IRGC was structured as a parallel military force loyal to the supreme leader and the revolutionary doctrine, distinct from the conventional Artesh military, with its own command structure, its own economic enterprises, and its own intelligence and counterintelligence capabilities. Across 40 years of operation, this structure produced a specific equilibrium in which the various institutional actors competed for influence within bounded parameters set by the supreme leader's ultimate authority. The competition produced policy outcomes that were sometimes incoherent, but the institutional structure remained intact, and external counterparties could engage with the regime through the civilian institutions on the assumption that those institutions retained meaningful authority within their assigned domains. The structure has now collapsed. The supreme leader's ultimate authority transferred from Ali Khamenei to his son Mojtaba on March 8th, without the deliberative process that the constitutional procedures had assumed would occur, and Mojtaba's legitimacy has been challenged from within the religious establishment in ways that have weakened the office's capacity to discipline the institutional competition that the office had historically managed. The IRGC under Vahidi has used the legitimacy gap to capture the operational state functions, with Vahidi reportedly informing President Pezeshkian explicitly that, given wartime conditions, all key managerial posts would be selected and run by the IRGC until further notice. The civilian institutions have lost the ability to fulfill the functions that the institutional structure assigned to them, but they have not been formally abolished. The result is the hollow shell that Ghalibaf's resignation has now made visible to international observers. But there is a second thing almost no one is connecting properly. The structural transformation has occurred under conditions of active war and ongoing diplomatic negotiations with the United States, which means the transformation has not been processed by external counterparties as a regime change but as a continuation of normal Iranian governance with personnel turbulence. This perception gap has produced specific operational consequences. Western diplomatic counterparties, including the United States negotiating teams operating through Pakistani mediation, have been engaging with Iranian negotiators on the assumption that those negotiators carry institutional authority to commit the Iranian state to specific terms. The internal evidence now emerging through Iranian press reporting and through the resignation pattern indicates that this assumption has been false for an extended period. Ghalibaf, despite his nominal authority as Speaker of Parliament and head of the negotiating team, did not have the authority to include the nuclear issue in talks with Washington, an authority that any genuine head of an Iranian negotiating team would necessarily possess. His attempt to do so produced his immediate reprimand and forced resignation, indicating that his negotiating role was constrained by limits that had not been disclosed to his American counterparts. Foreign Minister IRGC, who has continued to participate in the negotiations and has carried Tehran's proposal to Islamabad, has been functioning according to internal Iranian sources as an aide to IRGC Commander Vahidi rather than as a representative of the elected government, which means his diplomatic communications carry the authority of the IRGC rather than the institutional government that international counterparties have been engaging with. The negotiating delegation that was prepared to travel to Islamabad for talks was derailed when a message from Mojtaba Khamenei's inner circle ruled out discussing nuclear issues and reprimanded the foreign ministry team over earlier negotiations, indicating that the actual locus of decision-making is in the Supreme Leader's office and the IRGC, not in the civilian institutions that have been the formal interlocutors. This reveals something fundamental about the limits of the diplomatic framework that Pakistani mediation has been attempting to operationalize. The framework has assumed that an Iranian government exists, with which a deal can be negotiated. The structural reality is that the Iranian government has been progressively hollowed of the authority required to negotiate, and the actual authority that could conclude an agreement resides in institutional locations that the diplomatic framework has not been engaging with directly. The negotiations have therefore been operating on a fictional architecture in which the formal counterparties lack the authority to commit, while the actual decision-makers have been outside the diplomatic process entirely. The first thing you need to understand to make sense of the structural transformation is the specific concept that scholars of revolutionary regimes refer to as the institutional capture sequence. Institutional capture occurs when one institutional actor within a multi-institutional regime progressively absorbs the authority of other institutions while leaving the institutional shells intact, producing a regime that operates differently from how its formal structure would suggest. The sequence has occurred in multiple historical cases: the Bolshevik consolidation following the 1917 Russian Revolution, the gradual party-state fusion in late Mao-era China, the Brezhnev-era stabilization in the Soviet Union, and it follows specific patterns that scholars have documented across these cases. The patterns include the progressive removal of authority from formally responsible institutions through emergency declarations that invoke wartime or crisis conditions, the placement of capturing institution personnel in nominally independent positions across the captured institutions, the use of regulatory and administrative mechanisms to constrain the actions of personnel from the captured institutions, and the construction of parallel decision-making structures that bypass the captured institutions entirely. Every one of these patterns is now visible in the Iranian case. The IRGC has invoked the wartime conditions following the February 28 strikes to justify the centralization of authority. IRGC personnel have been placed across ministerial and sub-ministerial positions throughout the civilian government, with Vahidi explicitly authorizing such placements. The administrative mechanisms governing diplomatic negotiations have been used to constrain civilian negotiating authority, with reprimands and forced resignations imposed on civilian officials who attempt to exercise authority that the institutional capture has reserved for the IRGC. Parallel decision-making structures have been constructed through the close coordination between Mojtaba Khamenei's inner circle, Vahidi's command structure, and selected civilian officials willing to function as conduits for IRGC authority. The capture sequence is therefore not a hypothetical possibility but an empirical reality, and the international community must now adjust its understanding of the Iranian state to account for this reality rather than continuing to operate on the institutional structure that the capture has rendered fictional. The second thing the Western press is missing is the specific interaction between the institutional capture and the broader strategic position of the Islamic Republic in the current crisis. The capture has produced specific operational consequences that affect every dimension of Iranian decision-making. The negotiating capacity of the Iranian state has been compromised because the formal negotiators lack the authority to commit, while the actual authorities have institutional incentives that diverge from those of the formal negotiators. The IRGC under Vahidi has institutional incentives to maintain the war footing that justifies its centralization of authority, which means the IRGC would lose institutional power if a comprehensive settlement with Washington were reached. The civilian government under Pezeshkian has institutional incentives to reach a settlement that would relieve the wartime conditions and restore civilian authority, but lacks the operational capacity to negotiate such a settlement effectively. The resulting dynamic produces continuous frustration of negotiations, with civilian negotiators making proposals that the IRGC subsequently overrides through the Supreme Leader's office, and IRGC representatives making proposals that civilian negotiators recognize as unacceptable to international counterparties. The negotiations therefore cannot produce a settlement under the current institutional configuration, regardless of the substantive terms that might theoretically be acceptable to all parties, because the institutional structure does not contain a single locus of authority capable of committing the Iranian state to comprehensive terms. The strategic implications extend beyond the specific Iran-US negotiations. The same institutional incoherence affects Iran's relationships with its proxy network, with the Houthi movement in Yemen, with the various Iraqi militia groups, with the remnants of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and with the broader regional security architecture. Each of these relationships requires institutional authority to manage, and the institutional capture has fragmented that authority across competing centers within the Tehran regime, producing inconsistent signals to the proxy network and progressively degrading the regime's ability to coordinate its regional posture. This reveals something fundamental about the limits of how external observers have been interpreting Iranian behavior in the current crisis. The interpretation has assumed that Iranian behavior reflects coherent strategic decisions made by a unified leadership. The institutional reality is that Iranian behavior reflects the unstable equilibrium between competing institutional centers that lack a common decision-making framework, and the apparent coherence of Iranian behavior at any given moment masks the deeper incoherence of the underlying institutional structure. This reveals something fundamental about the limits of regime resilience in the post-revolutionary phase. Revolutionary regimes typically pass through three institutional phases. The first phase is the consolidation of authority by the original revolutionary leadership, during which institutional structures are constructed to embody the revolutionary doctrine. The second phase is the routinization of authority, during which the institutional structures stabilize and the original revolutionary leadership gives way to successors who operate within the institutional framework. The third phase is the institutional crisis phase, during which accumulated tensions within the institutional framework produce challenges to the framework's continued operation. Most revolutionary regimes either reform during the institutional crisis phase to address the accumulated tensions, or transition to a different regime type altogether. The Islamic Republic has been in the institutional crisis phase for an extended period, with the various reform efforts of the Khatami presidency, the protests of 2009 and 2017 and 2019 and 2022, and the broader pattern of public dissatisfaction reflected in the 92% figure indicating the depth of the crisis. The combination of the February 28th strikes, the killing of Ali Khamenei, and the rapid elevation of Mojtaba Khamenei has accelerated the institutional crisis to a phase in which reform within the existing framework is no longer possible. The regime is therefore in the institutional transition that revolutionary regimes typically experience at the end of their institutional crisis phase, but the transition is occurring under conditions of active war rather than under the conditions of internal political contestation that have characterized previous revolutionary regime transitions. The combination produces a transition trajectory that has no precise historical analog and whose outcome cannot be confidently predicted from the historical record. The most likely outcomes include the consolidation of direct IRGC rule with the civilian institutions formally abolished or reduced to ceremonial functions, the fragmentation of the regime into competing factional fiefdoms with diminished central authority, or the negotiated transition to a successor regime under conditions imposed by external pressure. Each of these outcomes carries substantial consequences for Iranian regional posture, for the global energy market, and for the broader architecture of Middle Eastern security. The third thing, and this is the piece that demonstrates why the situation cannot stabilize within the existing institutional framework, is the specific dynamic of the resignation cascade that the moderate Iranian press has now begun describing publicly. Resignation cascades in revolutionary regimes follow a documented pattern. The cascade typically begins with a small number of resignations by officials whose institutional positions have been compromised by structural changes within the regime. The initial resignations create incentives for additional officials to consider their own positions, because the cumulative loss of senior personnel signals that the institutional framework is unstable and that remaining in place may carry costs that exceed the benefits of continued service. The additional resignations accelerate the cascade by further reducing institutional coherence, which creates conditions in which the remaining officials face increasingly difficult operational environments. At a certain threshold, the cascade transitions from a controlled outflow of dissenting officials to an uncontrolled collapse of institutional capacity in which the remaining officials cannot perform their functions because the supporting infrastructure of personnel and institutional relationships has been degraded beyond the point of operational viability. The Iranian regime is now at an early stage of this cascade. 3 senior presidential aides have resigned. The Speaker of Parliament has been forced from his negotiating role. The Vice President has attempted resignation multiple times. The President has reportedly considered resignation. The Foreign Minister is the object of joint dismissal efforts by the President and Speaker. The state television anchor has publicly questioned the President on national broadcast. The pattern indicates that the cascade has moved past the initial phase and is in the acceleration phase, with the threshold to uncontrolled collapse approaching. The specific timing of the threshold is unpredictable from publicly available information, but the trajectory is clear. The regime cannot stabilize in its current institutional configuration because the cascade dynamic continues to operate, and the dynamic will continue until either the institutional structure is fundamentally reformed in ways that address the underlying causes of the cascade, or the cascade reaches its terminal phase and the institutional structure collapses operationally. And this is where the operational reality of the Tehran regime breaks from the institutional structure that has historically defined it. For 4 decades, since the consolidation of the Islamic Republic following the 1979 revolution, the regime has operated through the institutional structure that Khomeini designed. The structure produced specific patterns of behavior, the careful balance between civilian and clerical authority, the management of factional competition within bounded parameters, the maintenance of a coherent foreign policy despite internal disagreements, the functioning of the negotiating apparatus as a representative of the regime rather than as a captured component of one institutional actor. These patterns have ended. The civilian institutions exist as shells without their historical authority. The clerical authority has been weakened by the legitimacy crisis surrounding Mojtaba Khamenei's succession. The IRGC under Vahidi has captured the operational state functions but has not constructed the legitimacy infrastructure required to sustain its authority over the long term. The combined effect is a regime that lacks coherent institutional structure to manage its strategic challenges, that lacks legitimate authority to discipline its internal contradictions, and that lacks the operational capacity to negotiate a settlement that could relieve the pressures producing the institutional crisis. The regime that international counterparties have been engaging with is therefore fictional in the most consequential sense. The formal structure does not correspond to the operational reality, and decisions made on the basis of the formal structure will not produce the outcomes that the formal structure would predict. Every diplomatic interlocutor, every commercial counterparty, every regional actor, and every domestic Iranian constituency that has been operating on the assumption that the Islamic Republic continues to function as it has historically functioned must now adjust to the empirical reality that the historical functioning has ended. The adjustment will produce changes in expectations, in negotiating positions, in commercial decisions, and in regional alignments that will reshape the strategic environment over the coming weeks and months. The changes will be cumulative, and the cumulative effect will be the reorganization of the international relationship with Iran around the actual operational reality of the post-February 28 regime, rather than around the institutional structure that the regime has visibly retained but operationally abandoned. Your watch window over the next 48 to 72 hours is concrete and specific. Watch for any additional resignations from senior positions within the Pezeshkian administration, particularly Vice President Mohammad Reza Aref, key cabinet ministers including Foreign Minister IRGC, and senior advisors within the presidential office. The pace and seniority of additional resignations will indicate whether the cascade is accelerating toward its terminal phase or stabilizing under pressure from the IRGC. Watch for any communications from Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei's office regarding the negotiating framework with Washington, particularly any statements that explicitly authorize or rule out specific topics for discussion. Watch for movements by President Pezeshkian, particularly any indications that he is preparing to step down or that he has been removed from operational decision-making in ways that confirm his political marginalization. Watch for the specific behavior of the IRGC under Commander Ahmad Vahidi, particularly any public statements or operational decisions that confirm the institutional capture pattern or that signal further consolidation of IRGC authority over civilian functions. Watch for any movements by the Iranian Students' Polling Agency or other domestic survey organizations regarding the publication of additional dissatisfaction data, because the willingness or unwillingness of the regime to suppress such data will indicate the regime's confidence in its capacity to manage public opinion. Watch for any communications from Pakistani diplomatic channels regarding the status of the mediation framework, particularly any indications that Islamabad has assessed the negotiations as no longer viable due to the institutional incoherence on the Iranian side. And watch for the specific behavior of regional actors, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and Iraq, regarding their bilateral relationships with the Tehran regime, because regional adjustments will reveal the assessments that informed observers have made about the durability of the current Iranian institutional configuration. The speaker has resigned from the negotiating role. The president attempted resignation in March. The vice president has attempted resignation multiple times. 3 senior aides have left. The foreign minister is targeted for dismissal. The IRGC commander has captured the operational state. The supreme leader's legitimacy is contested within the religious establishment. The state television anchor has questioned the president publicly. The dissatisfaction survey shows 92%. The negotiating delegation was derailed before reaching Islamabad. The diplomatic framework has been operating on a fictional architecture. The institutional capture sequence has reached its acceleration phase. The resignation cascade is in motion. The civilian institutions exist as shells. The clerical authority has been hollowed by succession. The IRGC has not constructed legitimacy infrastructure. The regime cannot stabilize in its current configuration. The international community has been negotiating with a fiction. The operational reality of the Tehran regime has not shifted. It has fundamentally broken from the institutional structure that has historically defined it. Vidai Kyopas, 4.7 Adaptive,